Hi everyone. Does the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur have any basis in reality? Well, the idea of the Minotaur being this bull, this half-bull, half-man creature in this labyrinth at Knossos on Crete has obviously lent itself to the interpretation that this may well come from the Minoan practice of bullfighting in the center courtyard of the palace of Knossos, which was obviously on Crete. So that seems to tie in quite well, because you have this bull-like creature in a labyrinth in the legend, and in the reality, in the Minoan civilization, you have bullfighting, so obviously some people likely died, in this palace of Knossos, which has been described as very labyrinthine. It's very, very complex. It has many, many dozens of rooms. It's very large. It's very much like a labyrinth, even though it's not actually a literal labyrinth, but it's a very complex area where in the center people fought bulls, and obviously some of them must have died. So that lends itself quite easily to the idea that that was the origin of this legend of people being thrown into this labyrinth where there was a Minotaur, a half-bull creature, and obviously some of them died. Most of them, apart from Theseus, died. However, there are some key issues with that. First of all, the palace of Knossos was thoroughly inhabited and occupied. It was used. It was the administrative center of the Minoans in that area. It was a busy place full of people, and that doesn't match the legend of the labyrinth, which held the Minotaur. The only occupant of the labyrinth in Greek legend was the Minotaur. So that doesn't really tie in very well with the way that the palace of Knossos was used in the Minoan era. Also, this practice of bullfighting in the palace of Knossos was something which the Minoans did, but the Mycenaeans defeated and conquered Minoan Crete in about 1450, whereas the story of Theseus and the Minotaur is set just a generation before the Trojan War. According to the traditional date of the Trojan War, that would be about 1200 BCE. So a generation before that would be around 1250, or at most we'd be looking at around 1300, because some people place the Trojan War in about 1250, although that's a rather early date for it. Most people place it in 1184 or thereabouts. But anyway, you get the idea. That's the general era in which the Trojan War supposedly took place. Theseus lived a generation before that. So the origin of the story of the Minotaur should have been something to do with around about the era of 12 to 1300 BCE. But like I said, the Minoans were conquered by the Mycenaeans in about 1450. And as far as I'm aware, I might be wrong about this, but as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence for bullfighting in Mycenaean Crete. After 1450, after the Mycenaeans conquered Crete, I'm not aware of any evidence that the Mycenaeans engaged in bullfighting at the palace of Knossos, unlike the Minoans. So how can we explain the truth behind the legend of the Minotaur? Well, if you're a follower of my channel, if you've seen my videos before, or if you've read my material online, you probably know that I believe that the Trojan War did not happen in about 1200 BCE. Instead, I believe it happened in about 700 BCE. So obviously, that would be a completely different era of Crete. So how does this revised date tie in with the issue of the Minotaur and the historical reality on Crete? If we look in the 700s, do we find a better historical explanation for the Minotaur? Well, as it happens, the palace of Knossos, or rather Knossos as a whole, it experienced somewhat of a revival from around about the 9th century, the end of the 9th century. So in the 700s, there was a large settlement, evidently the administrative center. I'm not sure if palace would be the right word, but it was a large settlement there, which was many, many acres in size. And just next to it was the Palace of Knossos. So it wasn't a revival of the Palace of Knossos, but it was a revival of a large administrative centre just next to it. So we have this interesting situation where you've got this large settlement which would match Minos, the Palace of Minos in the legend, because Minos was the king of Knossos. So he had his large settlement that he ruled over and that he ruled from. And just next to it, in the 700s, we find this large labyrinthine structure completely abandoned, empty. Well, not completely abandoned, and this is a key point. We know from archaeology that there was religious activity of some kind going on in the Palace of Knossos at that time. Whether there was actually bullfighting going on, who can say? Maybe not, maybe there was. But in any case, we know that it was viewed as a sacred site because religious cult activity was going on there in the 700s, in this basically enormous labyrinth, abandoned, not full of people like in the Minoan era, but just next to this large administrative centre. So that is a much, much better match for the legend of Theseus and Minos and the Labyrinth and the Minotaur than the situation that we find in the Minoan era, where the Palace of Knossos was full of people. So, in my opinion, that matches much better with my revised date of the Trojan War, 700 BCE. And if you check out my book, The Trojan Kings of Britain, you'll find many more pieces of evidence to back up this revised date.